How's everyone doing? So, I think if a church leaves its Christmas decorations up for too long, that I can be at liberty to tell a Christmas joke. Is that okay? Now, if you've heard this, don't shout it out. It'll throw off my comedic timing. So, why is the alphabet different during Christmas than any other time during the year? Because it has no L. That's the best you're going to get from me today, I promise. Humor is not one of my gifts. In fact, how many of you have made New Year's resolutions? Just a handful. 3 of you. Oh. We're an ambitious bunch. How many of you have broken those New Year's resolutions already? So I told my kids that one of my New Year's resolutions was to maybe not embarrass them as much. I think I might have just broken that. So, yeah, I see them back there. Turn with me, if you will, to Colossians chapter 3. This morning, we're going to look at a passage that I think first and foremost has been something that the Lord has been speaking to my heart. When John asked me to teach, there were several different sections of Scripture I kind of were praying about and thinking through. I think primarily whenever you're given an opportunity, you should probably preach the one that is most convicting. And so for me, this has been something I think the Lord has been really stirring and working in my heart. It has to do with the thinking process and how as Christians we approach the mentality that we're supposed to possess as believers. If truth be told, and I were to honestly examine where my thinking and where my heart is, I mean, it's no secret that we have an enemy that tries to distract, that tries to disrupt, that tries in essence to destroy anything that is to be thinking on things of Christ. You know, in some self-examination, I kind of found that the Lord was challenging me in how I was thinking about just life in general, you know, the season of life I'm in, where my own walk with the Lord has been. I found myself lazy at times, spiritually. I found myself too disengaged from maybe the battle that was in front of me. And so that's why the Lord brought me to this passage of Scripture to really meditate on. So if you'll read with me in chapter 3, verse 1, I'm going to read these verses and then we're going to pray. If then you have been raised with Christ, keep seeking the things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on the things above, not on the things that are on the earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. And when Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for such a perfect word, that your word has an authority unlike any other. It's an authority that can penetrate into the deepest and darkest of hearts. It's an authority that can illuminate things that maybe seem dead and bringing them to life. Lord, I pray and I commit your word to you this morning. I pray for our hearts in here, mine first and foremost, that we would be receptive to what you would have to say, that there could be lasting transformative change take place, not just in this next 45 minutes, but Lord, as we continue to seek and yearn for you throughout the days and the weeks and the months and however many years we're given until we see Christ face to face. We commit this time to you in Jesus' name. Amen. Before we dig into this, I feel it's necessary to kind of not only bring a little bit of background to where this section of Scripture lies into Colossians, but also maybe our approach to how we take Scripture and how we view these things. Listen, when it comes to our Christian walk and our Christian life, how we think is going to simply determine how we live. It's not a complicated process. But where it becomes complicated for us is at times we find a lot of opposing and a lot of competing voices trying to draw our attention or our affections into things absent Christ, absent the things of God. And so what's most important necessarily is not how we think about ourselves or how we think about our circumstances. It's how we think about God and where the place of God comes first and foremost in our thinking. And as we look at where Paul is addressing a Colossian church, even in these first 4 verses that we're going to look at this morning, there is a lot of context behind why he makes the statements he makes. And I think it's important for us to realize that when we come to Scripture and when we come to the Bible, I may be challenged throughout my week on thinking about my finances, thinking about my community or my relationships, thinking about my work, thinking about my marriage. But the Bible is not given to me to solve those problems. Primarily, the Bible is given to me to point to Jesus. And when I'm pointed to Jesus, then, and only then, will my thinking about my finances or my marriage or my relationships or anything else in my life, then it starts to find its holistic purpose in Christ. I hope that makes sense. Because if you don't make that distinction, what you're going to do is you're going to start imposing 21st century problems into a first century epistle. And you're going to start making the Bible about you and how the Bible all of a sudden is meant to solve your personal issues. Instead of keeping the triune Godhead in his glory and why the redemption of Christ is the central focus of what the Bible teaches. Listen, what the Colossians were dealing with in the first century is probably not much different than what we deal with in the first century. You're dealing with real people who have real issues that are struggling just like you and I. That's why Paul is going to make some profound statements. In fact, as I was studying through this, I found sort of 6 points I want to illustrate and highlight this morning. You know, I would say these are 6 points of how Jason Cunningham can be a better thinker. And I hope that you can draw something from them too. None of us are going to be experts on what was going on in the first century or what was happening, but what we can draw are some real contextual principles from how they're relating to things being challenged in their day to versus what we're experiencing in ours. In fact, when Paul makes these statements, which I think if you study the book of Colossians, you're going to see that this verse, chapter 3, verse 1, is probably his ultimate conclusive verse in the entire epistle. He's written everything up until this point so that he can draw the Colossians to this statement. If you have been raised up with Christ, keep seeking the things above where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. But it's not a standalone verse. It's a verse that is surrounded by a couple things that are very important to understand. If you draw your eyes just a little before this to chapter 2, verse 20, I'm not going to read all of them, but I want you to just glance through it. The Colossians are being challenged by something. They're being challenged by a form of, you could call it Gnostic legalism in some ways. They're being challenged with a religious fervor to do better, to be more perfect, to attain to a status that would lead them to a sense of a more holy life. That's why it says, if you've died with Christ to the elementary principles of the world, why, as if living in the world, do you submit yourself to decrees such as do not handle, do not taste, do not touch? All these concepts that are being thrown at this early Christian church, these new believers, and they're getting religious fervor from one side, saying you've got to perform. But then they're getting it from the opposite pendulum swing. Look at verse 5 and 6 of chapter 3, right after this statement that Paul makes. He says, therefore consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, greed, which amounts to idolatry. So they're not only getting tempted to go down the legalistic path, they're also getting tempted by the licentious path. And he's saying, and you've got to avoid that. So in a sense, the Colossians are being endangered by a religious Jewish culture telling them, you're not good enough. But they're also being tempted by a licentious Roman culture telling them, you're not satisfied enough. And doesn't this kind of hit home with where we're at in our day? I mean, we can see our world present its form of legalism to us. Now, I will say, in all the years of ministry I've served, I've never seen anyone struggle with, like Paul is talking about here in some respect, like Sabbaths, new moons, things like, I've never had someone say, you know what, I'm really tempted by the new moon principle. Like it's just really every time there's a new moon out, I really want to just be holy. That's typically not a 21st century struggle of legalism. However, the spirit behind that still pervades us today in our culture. Because all it is a repackaged version of you're not good enough. You need to try harder. And you need to strive more fervently. Now that is something the 21st century is good at predicting. And that's something that even in our Western thinking, a lot of times, this culture will present you as unsatisfied until you achieve. Well, they're getting it from there. And that's why Paul says in verse 1, and let's kind of start tackling some of these verses. He says, if you have been raised up with Christ, keep seeking the things above where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Here's the first point I think this verse shows us. I think we need to think on what is true. We need to think on what is true. You see, in the Christian life, your accomplishments, they cannot elevate you any higher than Christ already has. And I think some of us need to hear that this morning because you find yourself in this cycle of repetitive competitiveness within your own heart, where you think that somehow your efforts are not good enough to this ideal that you have created for yourself, which is not an ideal that the standard of Scripture holds to you. You see, the Colossians, they were in danger of legalism. They were in danger of some Jewish sect coming in and telling them, your performance isn't good. You need to set a whole ritual of standards to abide by. And until you abide by them, you're falling short. Well, guess what? Christians and churchianity can play the same games. We most certainly can set up our own standards. They may not be subscribed to some form of religion, but I know, because I've seen it in my own heart, I've seen it in many other people's hearts, that we can just stamp and sort of baptize our own self-proclaimed goodness. And we show up to church, or we show up to church meetings, or we show up to prayer, or we bring all of this baggage that comes with that performance mentality. And we think that if we're not doing enough, that all of a sudden God isn't pleased with us. I hope you understand that that denigrates the cross. That what Jesus did to put his life into humanity and to then take and sacrifice himself for the guilt of that humanity, it abolishes any need for the performance-driven life. We are now dictated by a faith that has been given to us, and we live not by what we can do, we live by what Christ has already done. And I think that's why Paul is saying, and notice he keys in on this, if you've been raised. You see, everything else that we try to subscribe to with the works or the efforts that we bring in the name of Christianity, that's really just sort of a form of dead orthodoxy. Paul is saying the Christian life is one that has been raised. If you've been raised with Christ. You see, if we're going to change our thinking, and Paul is saying how you think, how you set your mind on the things above, it starts with knowing the position of where Christ has placed you in his kingdom. It's one of resurrection. You see, life-giving thinking has to start with life-giving power. If you don't accept the position of your reality that you've been raised with Christ, you are united with him, then you're going to fall back down to the earthly world of thinking. You're going to fall. And so Paul says, if you've been raised with Christ, keep seeking the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Now, I will say that in this first verse, I believe that Paul's conclusive argument is here, and the next 3 verses we're going to read are sort of an elaboration on this. Because what we see is that it starts with the resurrection. That's where transformative power and thinking in the Christian life is always going to start. You have to start with a raised mentality. And then you move into, well, how does that play out practically? He says, keep seeking the things above. Here's the second point I think we need to see, is that not only do we need to think on what is true, but we need to think on what is powerful. Our attention has to be focused on the person of God's approval, not man's. And I don't know about you, but when you look in the mirror, a lot of times this is where you might think it relies on you. And what Paul is saying is, Colossians, if you've been raised, don't look in the mirror. Keep seeking the things above. Now, what does that mean? Keep seeking the things above. I think the idea that he's presenting is one of exalted authority, of exalted influence. That there has to be something higher than ourselves for us to be able to grasp hope. Because when you look across the spectrum of something linear like ourselves or other people, it's hard to find hope. Because you're always going to find something less than what is ideal. And the ideal power that Paul is talking about is where Christ is. Notice that, seated at the right hand of God. Now, I think there's 2 things in this statement that are kind of important that you don't want to overlook. The first is, notice how he describes Christ's activity, which is one of sitting. He says he's seated. And then notice the location of where he places Christ, at the right hand of God. Now remember, when we're dealing with the resurrection and what Paul has stated here in verse 1, he's showing us that for us to maintain sort of this attitude of hope and of perpetual seeking, we have to put our attention on the focus of where that hope is going to lie. He says in verse 1, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. I think it was probably, 4, 5, 6 months ago? I don't remember the last time I taught when John had me to teach, but I taught from a passage in Hebrews about the ascension of Christ. And basically how Christ has taken our humanity and he's ascended it into a place where it is fully secure, where it is fully guarded, the right hand of God. And it's sort of the same principle here, and I think it's worth reiterating that when we talk about Christ, when we talk about his present ministry as our mediator, as our high priest, as the one who is seated on the throne, notice that what Paul says here is that he's seated at the right hand of God. Now, as someone who is seated, that means he's ruling from a position of authority, but he's also ruling from a position of rest. Listen, Jesus isn't nervous about what's going on in this world. He doesn't sit there with like this nervous tick, bouncing his leg around like, I hope my church can get it right. He is not as neurotic as we are. I promise you that. He is not anxious. He is not worried. He is in complete rest and he is in complete authority. It doesn't matter if it takes 5 days for the House of Representatives to nominate someone. Jesus knew every second of those 5 days and ordained when that time would come. As with all the other rulers of the world, as with all the other problems that face humanity, there's nothing outside of his control. And that's why I think Paul is saying, Colossians, you need to set your mind on the things above, where there is a greater power that overrules the powers of this age and the powers of this world, because heaven is ruled not just by God in his essence, but by man in his fullness. He's taken our humanity and he's ascended it to a place where it is untouchable. It is fully authoritative. Jesus is ruling. That throne is not empty. It's the place of highest acceptance. God has bestowed on him the honor of rule for his people, for his church. And that's why he says, where he's seated at the right hand of God. I think we need to be reminded of this. I don't know if you are. There's times where I think I do, if I'm honest. I think there's times where we sometimes can sense almost a debilitating fear over what seems like the ever-expanding chaos that we are living in. I mean, it seems like no one is doing anything to correct anything. That we live in a constant stream of information and misinformation and disinformation and no information. And it's like, well, what is true? What is right? Well, if there's one thing that's right, it's this. Christ will never have an empty throne. He will always rule. And it leads into verse 2 where Paul elaborates on this. Well, how do we set our mind? How do we seek the things above? Verse 2, set your mind on the things above, not on the things that are on the earth. I think the third point that I see in this is that we are to think on what is heavenly. Not only are we to think on what is true, not only are we to think on what is powerful, but we're to think on what is heavenly. Because true Christian peace is found by looking upward more than by looking forward. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but I would measure to say that you probably are. Isn't it easy to look forward to the next thing in life and to somehow derive just a smallest sense of hope that things are going to get better if only this next thing occurs, or this next thing, or that next event? And what we do is we set up sort of this future that's determined, or this present happiness which is determined by a certain future expectation coming to fruition. And then if it doesn't come to fruition, it leads us down the path of despair, and then we look to the next future thing, and then the next future thing. Well, Paul isn't telling us to look forward to the next event in life. He's saying, look upward. Because when you look upward, you're looking into a realm that is beyond time and space and which is able to provide you with something more lasting than just that next opportunity or that next event or that next season of life, which you think is going to satisfy the present season of life or the present circumstance or the present thing that isn't satisfying to you. And so he says, set your mind on the things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on the things above, not on the things that are on the earth. Now, I don't think Paul here is telling us that we shouldn't be concerned or that somehow we should be ignorant of the things going on the earth. I don't think that's what he's saying here. It's not that he's saying don't know anything on the earth. He's not saying we should be ignorant. He's saying we should be unmoved. That we shouldn't let the things of this life move us from the place of peace or move us from the place of trust in the Lord. Earthly things are really only going to have earthly power. And I've found in my life that a lot of times it's not so much the things that are innately wicked, the earthly things that hinder my faith in Christ or my relationship with Christ. I find a lot of times it's things that they could be morally neutral. You see, we have an enemy who is very good at distractions. He's very good at diversions. You know, it doesn't have to be the most wicked, evil, vile thing that would try to sway us from our faith in Jesus. It could be something as simple as Netflix. You know, it's like the Lord can give you that pacifier and say, here, take a little Netflix pacifier. Jason, I know what you need. You need to just chill out. Just binge for 8 hours. It's like, oh. Now, I'm not here to say we don't have liberty for entertainment or for recreation or those types of things. What I'm saying is that I think Paul and the emphasis he lays on us here is that we can enjoy the things of earth, but we should not be enslaved by them. And if they start moving our hearts to a place where our emotions or our attention or our affections are given over to more of those things, then it's time for a good self-examination. Set your mind on the things above, not on the things that are on the earth. He says, for you have died. Notice this in verse 3. And your life is hidden with Christ in God. For you have died. I think we see the fourth point here in how we're to shape our thinking. Think on what is imputed. Not only think on what is true, not only think on what is powerful, not only think on what is heavenly, but think on what is imputed. Because if Paul is saying you have died in those three words, what he's in essence saying is that your greatest sense of guilt is behind you. That the best is ahead of you. The worst death you will ever experience, it's behind you. Your separation from God, your pre-Christian life, everything that was of death was then imputed to the one who died in your place. And because of that, you have died. Now, I hope you see the sense of freedom that comes from that statement. Because if you don't think you have died, you're going to try to prove yourself to God as worthy of his righteousness. How do you think that's going to end out? But if you've died, if the death of Jesus on the cross for you was something that was an imputed work of God, where he took what you deserved, he placed it on the son that didn't deserve it, our death was a consequence. Christ's death was not a consequence. It was a purpose. God sent him to this world for that purpose. And in doing so, he then binds those deaths. Where Paul can make a statement like this, he says, you have died. You don't need to try to find life in something that will never produce life. Your religious performance, your better performance, a better acceptance, or worldly pleasures. He says, you've died. Now, in what sense have we died? Well, I think this is a legal statement, primarily. I mean, Paul is saying that judicially we have died to the penal justice of God and his demands. We have died to the consequences of sin. We've died to the power of sin. We've died to the repercussions of what death brings. We've died to the principles that govern our world and of human conduct. The thing that the natural Adam wants to still prove himself. All of those things we've died to. And in a sense, we can also apply it to other areas. We have died to things in life in this world that feel attractive or that can make us feel alive. To put it another way, I think we must not only accept, but we must embrace sort of the dying part of the Christian life. How do we do that? Well, you have to do it because you've been raised with Christ. If you've been raised with Christ, then you can embrace all of the dying aspects that come with living the Christian life. Do any of you feel like you have dying hopes or dying dreams or dying ambitions? Things that you assumed in your life would come to pass, and maybe they didn't come to pass quite like you envisioned. Or maybe you've had opportunities that just seem to have died over the years. Well, guess what? I think that's part of that process we like to call sanctification, where what Jesus does is he allows those things in your life that maybe you thought might give you identity or might give you sort of a sense of living, well, they didn't quite work out the way you wanted to. But that's okay. And it's with purpose. Because what we find in those seasons of what feels like death, what he's doing is he's de-godding you from being your own Savior. And he is giving you the opportunity to see afresh that there is only one Savior for your life who will truly bring life. And so I like that statement that Paul says there, you have died. It's sort of the same statement he's made if you look back in chapter 2, verse 14. He says, he's canceled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us, which was hostile to us. He has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. Your greatest sense of guilt is in the past if you're a Christian. If you're not a Christian, then you're carrying the burden of that debt that cannot be repaid. And there is only one outlet for that debt to be blotted out. Not just covered over, but completely stamped out. And that is through the cross of Jesus, which Paul says, "For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God." Now, I will say that as I was sort of studying this week, this is the phrase that was, you know, when you come to those times in your Bible reading, it's like the hit home phrase, like, ugh, the gut punch. Ugh, that one hurt. This is it. Your life is hidden. Your life is hidden. In what sense is our life hidden? And what does this necessarily mean? Oh, sorry. Your life is hidden. I think in one sense this deals with the root of our identity. Now, I know we all struggle with identity issues. And some will say that the identity issues that you struggle with throughout life, well, those are a young man's game, young woman's game. No, it's still in the old man's game too. The older I get, the more I realize I've got identity issues. But the hidden life, the one that Paul says is bound up to a life we don't see, it's a life that's hidden. This becomes sort of that mystery of virtuous Christian living. Think about, for a minute, the word hidden. You know, I looked up the word in the Greek. It's the word krypto. We get our word crypt from it. You know what a crypt is, right? It's where you hide dead bodies. You put them in there and you get them out of sight. But you know what the word means in the Greek? It means to hide. Very profound, huh? To hide. Something that is not to be seen. I don't know if you've got kids, but my kids in particular, like I've seen over the years where, you know, there's maybe one of them that we'll call it, they'll start something. And as they start something, maybe another child then comes in and he wants to try to finish something. And in that process of adolescent growth, what you're seeing is that one of them ends up finishing it a little harder than what should have happened. And then one of them comes running and trying to hide behind dad because he knows that when the other one comes, it's not finished for him. And it's funny because as they're trying to hide, the reason they're hiding is because they sense, well, there's a bigger and a greater power if I hide behind this. And I won't be touched by the enemy. Well, think about what your truest life is. You know, you get up, you look in the mirror, and you think, that's me. That's not you in the truest sense. That's a version of you that is going to pass away physically, but the truest sense of you, the truest life of you, your life is in a better unseen reality. You're sitting in purple chairs. But are you really? Or is there a part of your life that is hidden that is unseen to this realm, that is unseen to this world, and yet it is much more secure and much more protected than you could ever fathom. And I think that's what Paul is saying here when he says your life is hidden. And the fifth point that I draw from this is that think on what is secure. Because even though our life isn't fully revealed, it is fully protected. Now, I don't know if you play these games with yourself, but how you view yourself and how you view your life, do you ever have like a best version of yourself? Like the daydreamed version of you. The one that you think is going to come to pass in some point in the future. And maybe you have many different versions of you. Like, well, I'd like to be this, or I'd like to do that, or I hope one day that this is how my life is going to look like. And all of a sudden, we sort of have a lot of these different views of us. And we think that somehow life is going to then fall in line with all of these views that we've created and invented for ourselves. Well, I don't know what your best version of you is, but I can tell you what your worst version of you is. It's the version that you've invented and not the one that God has created. Because the version that you are to Christ, Paul says you are hidden with him. You don't have to compete with what the world wants to shape and mold you to be. You don't have to compete with what your fallen heart wants to shape and view you to be. You get to be the person that God created you to be once you discover Christ in your life and what he has. And I think the mystery of this that Paul says is that this hidden process is really two lives being lived out in singularity. His life and your life. It's now a hidden life. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a comfortable life. It doesn't mean that it's a life relinquished of all struggle or of suffering or of pain. What it means is that in the midst of all of that, you have a life that is unmoved. You have a life that is secure. You have a life that cannot be taken away from you. Because it is a life that is hidden in Christ or with Christ in God. Now I look at this and I think, what do I do on a daily basis? What do I do on a weekly basis? And I bet that if I were to venture to look on just a glimpse into each one of our lives, most of our lives are lived in sort of this anonymity, aren't they? Nobody knows what's going on day to day, your routines, whether you're going to the grocery store, picking up kids from school, changing diapers, endless loads of laundry, going to that same job that you feel like you've been stuck in for years. Are those things going to go viral in our world? Does our world look at that and say, man, that's a glorious diaper you've changed? There's just not that many things that we do that are going to garner the recognition and the applause of a world that doesn't place value on that. And yet, that is the hidden life. You know why? Because it's Christ living that life. I think this is where Jesus becomes our greatest example. Think about what we know from Scripture of our Lord. Absent one story in the Gospel of Luke that told what he was about when he was 12 years old, the only thing we know about him is from the age of 30 on upward. Now, if you think about God's wisdom and his plan, Christ lived for 30 years on this planet in human flesh, daily doing routine things, and nobody knew who he was. What was it like when he took a walk? Or he worked in his father Joseph's carpenter shop? Or maybe he went to go help harvest? Or maybe he was playing with his friends? You know, what about that season of life when maybe he was in his early 20s and he had some community? What did he do? Here you've got the glory of the ages, the creator of all things, living a hidden life. Israel didn't know him. His own family didn't know him. His friends didn't know who he was. They just considered him Jesus. He's kind of perfect, but he's Jesus. And yet, he knows what it's like to live a life of anonymity. A life where there's no recognition. A life where maybe there's this sense of burden, like where you feel, gosh, I don't know if I can keep going. Well, guess what? Look to Jesus. He knows what that's like. And I think that's just a beautiful thing about the hidden life. I think we need to realize that whatever version of yourself you have and that you hold to, just understand that Jesus does not love a future version of you more than the one that you are now. He can't. He doesn't view such things. And so, this brings us to our last point. Notice in verse 4, it says, "And when Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory." I think the sixth point, to help Jason Cunningham think better, is to think about your end. Think about your end. If Christ is your identity, then glory is your destiny. Imagine that day as Paul is encouraging this church, and he says, when Christ, who is our life, is revealed, we live a life that is hidden. We live a life that is bound up in one that is also, in a sense, hidden to this world. But when he is revealed, then the age of glory begins. Then every hope and aspiration you've ever had, it will be manifested. Then and only then will that time of illumined joy all of a sudden break through into this world of darkness. He says that's the time when Christ will be glorified, but he says you also will be revealed with him in glory. Listen, God made man to be glorified. He most certainly did. Man cannot be glorified apart from Christ. Man cannot be glorified in this age. But there is a day and age coming when Jesus comes, and when all of his saints come with him, you're going to see all of a sudden a realm peeled back where you will experience something of light like you have never seen. And this world has never seen. And I think that's why Paul leaves them in this encouragement sort of interwoven here between the legalism and the licentiousness. And he says, there is a time when glory is coming. And hope is one of the greatest and most powerful influences on your perspective and how you think. And Paul is saying, if we can set our mind on the things above, if we can allow ourselves to think of the glory that is upward and that is ahead, then it will guard us from falling into one of those two errors. And so with that, we leave. If we're going to make any resolutions at the beginning of this year, I know for me, I'm wanting to think better. I'm wanting to think more biblical. Then we need to keep Jesus on his throne. We need to think about what's upward.